Over this season, we've been talking a lot about growing hops out in the garden, but today we are looking at what you do with those hops. And we are here at Iron Monk in Stillwater, and joining me is Iron Monk's head brewer, Trenton Inselman. Trenton, thanks for sharing this. I mean, I'm excited to learn a little bit more about this process. So Tell me a little bit how we go from something that's out in the field that I know about to this, to then I can.
Yeah, so our process is a fairly lengthy multi-step process, but we do every bit of the actual beer making process in one day. And then the yeast is our friend, and he'll take us the rest of the way and get us our beer, which takes, for our typical beers, about 14 days.
Okay.
So we start with our malted germinated grains. For us, we get most of them from Germany, Belgium, different places like that, and malting facilities that have been there for hundreds of years.
And when you say germinated grains, we're not talking about hops yet. We're talking about the wheat, barley, rye, I'm assuming? Okay.
Yep, so all of our grains, it kind of depends on the style. We have wheat malt, we have rye malt, we have a pale malt, which is what our typical base is that we use in about every beer. We have Pilsner malts and Vienna malts that do different things and give you different beers and create different characteristics that you ultimately find in different styles of beers. Your colors come from different roasts and different caramelizations of the germination process.
Okay.
And so that's where we start, is with a recipe with our grains, and then we go from there. So,
and they're actually germinated seeds?
Yeah,
okay.
So the seeds, they go through a malting process, huge malting facilities that those companies have. They'll actually get the grains wet to start, so they'll start to grow their seed and kind of pack all their starches and sugars. They'll dry them out, bag them, send them to us, so we get all that sugar is what we're ultimately after in our process.
Okay.
And so grain is one of the main components in our beer making process. We have our recipes, and then we have what we call our mill room, where we have a mill and a giant auger, and we'll mill our grains. They'll go up through our hopper, and it's a gravity-fed system where we'll put 12 to 1,800 pounds of grain. At that point, it's called grist. It's been cracked. It's ready to be added to water, where that sugar can come out in solution. So that first step involves a machine called our mash tun. Our mash tun is where we'll actually hydrate that grist, put it back into warm water. So our temperature matters at this point.
So that grist's like a powder, I'm guessing.
Yeah, so it's a little, not quite as fine as just a pure flour or a pure powder. There's still some grain and some material there.
Okay.
So too fine actually would help your efficiency, but it's going to hurt your machine. You're going to get all powder, and it's no fun. It
gets clogged up. Okay.
Yeah, we get what's called a stuck mash, and that'll take hours. So we like that perfect
Nobody
balance.
wants a stuck mash.
Exactly. Yes, it makes the long day longer. We want to mash at a certain temperature where those processes can act and do their best work, and that's going to matter with efficiency. We let that get full with all of our grain, and there's rakes that spin and get everything stirred up and nicely mixed up in that mash tun.
So it's basically like brewing, kind of, right?
Yeah.
Like literally you're just letting it marinate in there.
And then we're going to let it set for an hour.
Okay.
An hour is about the perfect time for all those chemical processes to take place. All of those sugars have been converted to the starches that we need in our next processes. So all the things that need to happen at that point have happened. And then we do what's called lauter. Everything we do essentially is a German term.
I was going to say, you have different terms for everything,
so it just means transfer or move.
Okay.
So we're going to move our liquid, which at this point is called wort, W-O-R-T, to sugar water.
Okay.
And we move it into our brew kettle. We have a 43-ish barrel brew kettle, which is fairly large. A barrel of beer is 31 gallons.
Wow.
So we can produce quite a bit of liquid in a day. We get there.
Y'all have one of the largest, right, in the state?
We do have one of the larger brew houses in the state.
Okay.
It's good and bad. So it requires, every time we brew, we have to brew a lot of beer. So when you want to do a beer for a friend's bike race, it requires a little more nuance and a little more challenge, because you don't quite need
that
40
much.
barrels of beer for a weekend. So it allows us to produce a lot and to stay ahead of production, but it also provides its own challenges in not being able to do as limited of releases as maybe some other breweries do. But we'll fill our kettle with our wort, and we'll boil it. So the boil is going to last an hour, and that's, again, similar brewing industry. It's just standard. As soon as the boil starts, if you want your beer to have, and it depends on what bittering agent you want. So this is where our hops are first introduced.
Okay.
Once we're full and our wort is in our kettle, that's where we're going to add our hops. Different stages in the boil create different enzyme reactions and different chemical processes, which creates different levels of bitterness.
Right.
At the very end of the boil, we typically add a flame out hop, which is going to give us most of our characteristics. That is the last hop addition we use for almost all of our beers, except for our IPAs, where we'll do what's called dry hopping, and that happens in the fermenter at the end of fermentation.
So tell us a little bit about that fermentation.
Yeah, so fermentation, at the end of our boil, what's called knockout, we knock our wort out into a fermenter. We have 12 fermenters here in the brewery, and those we use as dual process tanks. So we use them both for fermentation and for finished product. We'll add our yeast day of brewing. Once we get to our appropriate temperature where the yeast is going to do its best, we'll blast in our yeast. We do it in line during transfer. Two different ways. We either use fresh yeast, which just comes out of a packet, we rehydrate it, shoot it in, or we'll use yeast off of a different tank where that beer is already fermented, its yeast is still viable, and we'll actually collect that yeast and use it in a different beer.
So yeast is a microorganism, and it just wants to eat the sugar water, right?
Yes, and it lasts a long time. So we'll typically get 8 to 10 beers out of a single pitch of yeast.
Okay.
And so we'll use 3 little bags of yeast, and then they'll last us for 10, sometimes 10 beers, which I brew about every week, so it'll last us about 10 weeks.
Okay.
Really cool way to save money, and also that yeast is more viable. There's a whole lot more cells now because they reproduce and they go crazy in there. So when we reuse it, it kicks fermentation off faster, and we actually ferment a little faster.
Oh, okay. So what is the yeast actually doing in there?
Yeah, so the yeast is eating the sugar that we created from our grains, and it's turning our sugar water into alcohol, producing both alcohol, which is what we want, which is what's turning us into beer. And then they have CO2 as an off gas. And in all of our tanks, we have a blow-off arm where we'll put a hose in a bucket of water and actually watch that CO2 bubble out.
Okay.
And we know that sugar is being consumed by the yeast. Once that slows down, we know that we've essentially eaten all the sugar we can, and our beer's pretty well finished.
Oh, okay.
At that stage, we'll drop our temperature. We typically drop our temperature down to about 29 degrees, and that allows for flocculation of all the yeast and any matter that's in the beer. It'll fall out of solution. Our fermenters are conical shaped, so there's a cone at the bottom, and that allows all the yeast and anything in there to fall into that cone where we can actually get the yeast out and save our beer. We actually do that backwards. We take our beer off the yeast, but we still do drain the yeast. Once our beer's finished at 29 degrees and everything's done,
Is it ready?
we're really close. So the only thing we lack at this point is carbonation.
Oh, okay.
We'll transfer it to a second fermenter, and at this point we have only beer. We've left the yeast in the tank. We'll end up draining it off and washing that original tank. Our second tank, we have what's called the carb stone, and it really is a piece of metal in the tank that we shoot CO2 direct carbonation into the beer. Has tiny little holes, and
It's like
those
one
holes.
of those air stones in the aquariums. Right?
Yeah, it looks very similar. We just blast CO2, and it does what you'd see in a fish tank, and it
Okay.
just percolates up to the top, all these little bubbles.
So after you take the CO2 out of it, you're putting CO2 back
Correct.
into it. Okay.
Yeah. You can actually self-carbonate the beer with its own blow-off. It's tricky in what stage you
Right.
stop letting the CO2 out and it stays in the tank.
So this is more of a controlled method to do
This
that.
is a lot
Yeah.
easier, so
Yeah.
you don't have to worry about high pressure in different stages of the process. So simplest way is to let it finish. We add our own CO2 back.
Yeah.
Once we've hit our carbonation, the beer is completely finished and ready to drink. At that point, we typically can very quickly. We have a very large canning line, a 6-head fill canning line. That's where we kind of make the fun. I mean, that's the fun part really, is you get to take the beer out of the tank where you can't see it into a can that you can hold and drink and sell and enjoy.
Well, yeah, I mean, y'all are everywhere now. In the grocery stores, you don't just have to be here in Stillwater at the brewery to get it anymore. So, and even at our stadium, actually.
So we are lucky to have a strong distribution channel. We distribute statewide through 5 or 6 different distributors. They come pick up our product in 2 different ways. They pick up kegs and cans. We are statewide with both of those. So we sell a lot of cans, which are a fun way to showcase your product because you get to have fun artwork. And for us, we get to put Pistol Pete on a can, which is really cool. And then in a keg, which we have cool tap handles, and you'll see those in restaurants and bars across the state. So it's pretty cool to finally get to that stage where the beer's done. And that whole process takes about 14 days.
Well, Trenton, thank you so much for sharing a little bit more about this and showing us how we go from the garden to the glass with
Absolutely.
hops. Thank you
You're
so
welcome.
much. We hope you enjoyed this video as part of our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. You can also find even more videos on the OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel. And join us on social media for great gardening tips, photos, and discussion.